Green exploring the Conservative case for net zero. I'm determined to get you to your actual coffee break on time at 10:45, which will be outside there, not over there, so I'm going to kick straight off. My name is Rachel Wolfe. I run a consultancy called Public First and fairly regularly write and chair events for Conservative Home. I'm delighted to welcome on my right Alexander Stafford MP, Member of Parliament for Rother Valley and member of the Bays Select Committee, and on my left Sam Hall, Director of the Conservative Environment Network, which I think is truly the most powerful organisation most people have never heard of, and is responsible, I think, in large part for the support for net zero in the Conservative Party. So no pressure, Sam. I'm going to kick off with a couple of opening questions to our panellists, and then I'm going to go straight open to you. Just as a warning, if they are long statements, not questions, I may cut you off. So please do think about how to formulate them so they at least sound like a question, even if you're quite sure you know the answer. So to start with, I'm going to go to Sam. And the question is, what's the Conservative case for net zero? You spent a long time developing this. What's your view?
Yeah, so I was going to start today by talking a bit about the long-term Conservative case for climate action, which has been there actually for a very long time, and then talk a bit about net zero in this current context and why some of those reasons for going for climate action over many years have now become even sharper and stronger given what's happening in Ukraine. So to start with, going back to the long-standing Conservative case for climate action, it goes all the way back to Edmund Burke, who wrote about the intergenerational partnership, the need to hand on to the next generation a healthy environment and an inheritance for them to look after and to take forwards. Margaret Thatcher specifically talked about the case for climate action at the UN General Assembly in 1989 and set out a very powerful case for concerted international action to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there has been this long intellectual heritage on the Conservative movement, within the Conservative movement rather, for climate action and for net zero. And so it only makes sense, therefore, that the party has been actually the party that's led a lot on climate action over the years in terms of actual policy. It was David Cameron who was the first leader of a major party to come out in favour of the Climate Change Act in the 2005 Parliament. It was Theresa May who enshrined net zero into legislation in 2019. And indeed, it has been Boris Johnson and subsequent Conservative Prime Ministers who've taken it forward and who've been delivering on that target. I think what's happened is that the left have tended to dominate the conversation, particularly in the media. There's been scepticism among some on the centre-right, and I think as a result there's been this perception that net zero climate action is not a Conservative enterprise, but I think that is precisely wrong. And one of the things that we try and do at the Conservative Environment Network is to amplify those Conservative voices that are making the case for climate action, but rooted in Conservative values. And so we support a caucus of backbench Conservative MPs, which Alexander is one of them, very pleased to say, helping them be the main campaigners on climate action in Parliament. And I think when we talk about the Conservative case for net zero, we need to articulate what it means distinctly from other alternative approaches. So for me, it's one that favours growth rather than degrowth. It's one that favours technological innovation in sectors like aviation rather than demand reduction. It's one that favours private investment in renewable energy production rather than putting in vast subsidies to a Green New Deal. It's one that embraces market forces and competition to make clean technology cheaper rather than setting up big state-owned energy companies. And it's one where as much power as possible is passed down to communities, to regions and to businesses to deliver net zero in a way that suits their areas, rather than one where Whitehall imposes a central plan. So I think we have the elements there of a Conservative case for net zero, and I think we need to be clearer sometimes in articulating the values and principles from which we are pursuing net zero. But I wanted to briefly zoom forward to the current time, and where obviously in this cost of living crisis, some have been saying that we should slow down net zero, we should abandon net zero, we can't afford it anymore because of how high the cost of living is. I actually think that's precisely the wrong way round. I think the high cost of energy is rooted in our dependence on gas and our reliance on gas for heating and for electricity, and so it actually makes the case to accelerate away from gas to go towards net zero even faster. The fewer wind farms we put up, the fewer heat pumps we install in people's homes, the fewer schools and hospitals we insulate, the more gas we have to import from overseas and burn, the more expensive our overall energy costs are, and the more the Treasury has to subsidise energy bills through the energy price guarantee. So I think there is a really strong case now for doubling down on net zero and for going even faster. Just to briefly finish on a few areas where I think we could be going even further to capture these potential fuel savings that net zero policies can bring. Firstly is around onshore wind in England. At the moment, the planning system effectively means that one person in a local community could object to a wind farm and the project can't go ahead. Onshore wind is one of the cheapest forms of new energy generation. We need to have a better, more balanced planning system that, yes, gives local communities the final say, the right to veto a new development if it comes forward, but where the Whitehall doesn't impose this blanket ban on all wind farm developments. Secondly, we need to get much better and faster at building out our grid infrastructure. At the moment, there are lots of these renewable projects which could be starting to generate electricity, which can't get grid connections fast enough. We need to allow Ofgem, we need to get Ofgem rather, to allow energy companies and networks to be investing ahead of need and building that grid infrastructure so that we can connect up cheap renewables to the grid and start bringing down people's bills. And finally, insulation and energy efficiency. We've got 19 million poorly insulated homes in the UK. Since the early 2010s, insulation rates have fallen dramatically as a result of cuts to various grant schemes, and that has cost the economy now, because of the cost of gas prices, we're in billions of pounds each year. Obviously, we can't expect governments to subsidise wealthy people's insulation measures, and I understand why governments have been sceptical about putting in really generous grant schemes for owner-occupiers. But we certainly could be doing more in terms of grants for fuel-poor households and social housing tenants, and we could be doing much more to make attractive financial products available to owner-occupiers so that they can install insulation measures and pay them back through their energy bill savings. We also should look at how the tax system could incentivise more people to insulate their homes, for example, giving people a rebate on stamp duty if they insulate their homes. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully there's some policy ideas to kickstart the discussion.
And Sam, just before I go to Alexander, one of the things that fascinates me is that poll after poll, and we've done some of these, shows that the electorate broadly supports net zero. People are very supportive of wind farms, including quite near them. They like the idea of renewables that reduce energy bills. There doesn't seem to be a strong electoral case not to do this. Yet, the Conservative Party is still very resistant to things like planning release on wind. Why is that? What's the gulf?
Well, I think, take wind as an example. In the 2010s and in the 2000s as well, I think there were a real sort of spree of onshore wind developments which were often imposed on communities. When a local council rejected it, had gone to the planning inspectorate, it was then forced on communities that didn't want them, and I think people felt powerless, and I think the Conservative government at the time overcorrected by blocking the technology altogether. I think, I think there's been that reluctance to even allow it back in for fear of creating that old
sort of
wild west scenario. I also think the other factor is that although the public opinion now is very strong in favour of onshore wind, I think a lot of people have crystallised their view around the popularity of onshore wind in an earlier time, when it was expensive, when there were these local projects that were, very controversial. And I think, the more we can talk about where the polling actually is on this technology, I think the better. And the more we can look at some incentives as well, for example, discounts on people's energy bills, that might also help them, I think, be willing to host turbines.
Brilliant, thank you. And Alexander, for a long time, the argument for net zero by Boris and others was about growth and jobs. Do you think that's still the argument, both in terms of appealing to people, but also being true? Is it valid?
Yeah, 100%. And actually, it's always bad coming after Sam because he knows far more about the topic and far better than any other Conservative about the issue, and I agree with everything he says. But I think growth is the most incredible, important part of things. We all know what's going on with the economy at the moment. It's going badly. We all know what's going on in unemployment. It's going to go up now. We all need to have more jobs. Now, when we talk about growth, there's only so much we can grow the current industries in the UK, only so much more value we can add. What I see when it comes to net zero, we can really add a lot more completely new jobs, completely new skills, and really grow that pie and make the UK one of the world's leader. We are one of the world leader, but even better when it comes to renewable technologies. And when we're talking about renewable energy, we shouldn't just literally talk about wind farms or batteries, although they're very important. We need to look at the whole ecosystem. The whole world is going net zero at different rates, but the whole world. If everyone is going the same direction, we know what we need to do. We need to make sure that we are indispensable to that outcome. And that covers things like green financial models, come back into investment, it comes about the physical skills, about the new technology. It also means taking risks on lots of different issues. One thing I often talk about, and chairman of All Particle and Hydrogen, is let's look at those sectors that are hard to decarbonise. We all know what the future was going to be passenger electric vehicles, it's going to be electric passenger vehicles, electric batteries. But have we really cracked the nut of shipping, of aviation? Have we really cracked the nut even of long distance haulage? We haven't. We need to, in the UK, be looking at those answers, not trying to chase almost the technology that frankly we can buy relatively cheaply from other countries. We have world leading experts when it comes to universities. We need to look at where we can fill those gaps. We need to actually use that as engines for growth. So I very much believe if we get this right and get further and farther with technology and the modelling, we can have a completely new industrial revolution and create jobs and wealth. And that will also increase buy-in for people, because one of the questions you just asked, which to Sam, was about why is there the gulf between in planning about people say they like wind turbines, but the government policy. I think one of the big issues of that is people don't necessarily believe in it, in the sense that everyone needs to keep the lights on and keep their homes warm, and they're worried for whatever reason that the technology won't provide it for them. They can rely on their old-fashioned central heating, they can rely on oil and gas, and coal. And there is that bit of, not skepticism, but a bit unsure about the future. If we show them actually the benefits of net zero are going to spread everywhere, we can really bring people on side. I think last year about 250,000 jobs were supported in the renewable sector, which has a lot of jobs, but it really isn't that many. We need to get far more jobs in the renewable sector. We need to make sure that in every aspect of the community is part of it. And one of the government's, good things they did in the last 5-8 years ago now, was put the Department of Energy and Climate Change into the BEIS department. I very much think they should be one together, because it shows the link between climate change, net zero, and actual jobs in the economy. The last thing that I would want, and I know there was some talk about it at the last reshuffle, is the departments being split up again. But we want to make sure that net zero is relevant to every job. We need to make sure the government needs to lead by showing in every single aspect of life there needs to be a net zero element. So when we're talking about plumbers and electricians, we need to make sure that they all are qualified now to install heat pumps, to install hydrogen-ready boilers and the like, just so that everyone is used to this and it's not that scary. Because ultimately, none of this technology is not like the Jetsons. It's going to be just what we do. We're still going to drive cars. We're still going to flip a switch and have energy in our homes. It's just going to be a different source of energy. And we need to take some of that mysticism out of it and just make it a bit more boring.
Do you think that now there's no money, this transition is still feasible? Heat pumps are relatively expensive now. We've relied on grants. We've relied on grants for electric vehicles. How do you do it in an era of fiscal restraint?
Well, by trying to not make it this sort of, well, we need to make it more boring. If you start giving grants to things, you're putting things on a pedestal. If you start doing something more special, we need to actually say, as I think the government did the right thing by putting a road tax, put road tax on electric cars. Actually say it's going to be no different to a car, it's just a better piece of kit. We shouldn't also mysticize some of the renewable technology. When it comes to heat pumps, it should just be like it's a form of heating. Now, the big question we're going to have, though, is things like heat pumps, hydrogen in the pipes, low carbon networks, is there's going to be a lot of different costs of producing energy and getting energy around the country. Not every home will be able to have a heat pump. Not every home will have hydrogen in the pipes. You will not ultimately have a choice over what heats your home. Depending on where you live, you'll have to choose one of whatever the options available. And I do see the concern is there will be potentially a price disparity between places that have a heat pump already installed for relatively cheap energy to some more conventional maybe blended gas in the pipe, including hydrogen. What we need to make sure, though, is everyone pays a comparable price. Because one of the big concerns I've got is if you frankly live in a larger home, larger attached home, you can install, albeit an expensive heat pump, but over time your energy bills are going to crash, which is good. But if you're living in poor accommodations, old Victorian Edwardian terrace housing, there's no space for a heat pump, you potentially can pay a lot more for your energy. So we need to make sure there's no second tier when it comes to poorer people paying more for their energy. And that, I think, is going to be the next big government conversation, how everyone pays the same for energy despite where it comes from.
Okay, I'm going to open up to questions. There was a gentleman here. Any other questions right now? And a gentleman behind him. Gentleman here at the second row from the front, and then 2 rows behind.
Thank you, Stuart Agnew. I'm a Norfolk farmer. This is about wind turbines. My county has been afflicted by these frightful things over the last few years. Thank God there's a pause on it. What really irritates us about these things is that they go whizzing around in the middle of the night when nobody needs the power, and the operators are paid constraint payments that we pay for to switch the blessed things off. Now, if we are going to have to go on with wind turbines, I would insist that under every existing one, a battery is placed that stores the electricity that isn't used when they're whizzing round, and that electricity can then be used when they're not going round. Is this a sensible suggestion or not? Thank you.
Good question. Let's take 2 and then we'll come back.
Thank you. As I explained when I asked my question in the last session, I'm a councillor in the London Borough of Bexley. We're regularly castigated because we're one of the handful of local authorities in London that hasn't declared a climate emergency. But what we have got on is actually doing practical things. And indeed today we've published our new borough plan, which includes a long list and audit of the things we've done. For instance, the fact that 6 years ago we installed LED lighting in our street lamps. The great and glorious Socialist Republic of Greenwich next door to us has just decided they're looking at it and worked out it's going to cost them about 10 times per unit that it cost us when we got on with doing it. And I'm just saying, is there more we ought to be doing as Conservatives about shouting about the things that we're actually doing as Conservatives where we have the power to do it? In administration locally, in administration regionally or nationally, because it was actually quite an eye-opener to us when we sat down. I have to say, at the suggestion of one of Sam's colleagues, who's one of my fellow councillors, that we ought to sit down and do it and realise just how much we have achieved and have been doing, saving our residents money and delivering a better environment.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the pragmatism question first, given that presumably right now someone's pouring oil all over a Kandinsky to demonstrate their desire for us to declare a climate emergency. Sam?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that suggestion. I think one of the hallmarks, I think, of a Conservative approach to this issue is around focusing on delivery and outcomes. I'm sure we'll see when we get to the general election in 2024, there'll be a race to set the most ambitious deadline to reaching net zero, or who can spend the biggest amount of public money on this transition. I think as Conservatives, we need to change the frame and the terms of the debate and focus instead on actually delivery against those targets and, an outcome. So, I think we, for example, would see a much greater role for private investment. To your point, Rachel, I think actually, yes, there's a need for some government subsidies to pump prime, accelerate the deployment of some of the technologies that are not yet cost competitive with their fossil fuel alternatives. But that amount, I think, will decrease over time as their costs come down. So I think this can be predominantly privately financed, and I think one of the traps in the sort of political debate on this issue that we frequently get into is this focus on money, on sort of declaratory statements about climate emergency rather than practical things. And I think Conservatives could be, do much more in terms of talking about their record, and hopefully that's something that we at the Conservative Environment Network can do as well. We work with lots of councillors to showcase the case studies that they have in their area that they've delivered in their council of environmental successes.
And Alexander, do you want to come on that and wind?
Yeah, I think going back to declaring a climate emergency, there's no more awful way of virtual signalling, and I was a councillor, than a council declaring a climate emergency, with a climate emergency workshop to discuss what we do in climate emergency. And then literally the next day in planning, they passed planning permission for like 400 homes on a field. The hypocrisy of local councils when it comes to this is astounding. One hand they're declaring climate emergency, the next minute they're concrete over a large chunk of any green space, concrete over gardens, building with back gardens, which is incredibly damaging for the environment. And I think any council that declares a climate emergency needs to have a long, hard look at themselves because they're embarrassing themselves. We all know what the situation, but we shouldn't just be doing virtual signalling. You ask what we should be doing about practical aspects of it. I don't think we should be shouting about, how many electric vehicle charging points you're putting in or solar bins, because that's what everyone should be doing anyway. We get no credit for doing it. It should be just the day-to-day running of councils now. We all need to work and things in a greener way. It's like no different from shouting about the bins that are being collected. They should be collected, or recycling anymore. I remember not that long ago, with the council I was on, they couldn't recycle plastic. Imagine if we're shouting about today that we can recycle plastic in our wheelie bins. It's absurd now. We've just moved on now. We just need to live what we do and not try and fight this sort of zero-sum game when it comes to energy and climate change, because the Conservatives are always going to lose out to Labour Liberals in the virtue of it, because they're always going to declare climate emergency, declare going to net zero in 2 years' time, and do nothing about it. So we might as well just live the lives. When it comes to wind turbines, I completely agree with you. Battery storage, or storage rather, because there's many ways you could store energy, whether it's hydrogen or something else, is incredibly important. I think it was really galling a few weeks ago. One of my councillors showed me, he's on, I can't remember which tariff it was, he's on Octopus or something, he showed me, despite energy prices going through the roof, he was paid to use energy during the night. The company was literally paying him for more energy he used because of the tariff he was on, because there was too much energy. They couldn't store it. And I just think that's a ridiculous criminal waste. That when bills go through the roof, that for a few hours he's timed all his washing machines to go on at like 3 in the morning, but he can still do it. So yes, storage is that big problem. And we should make sure we have storage, not just the wind turbine sites, but at people's homes as well. I think new homes need to have space for batteries already for them. I think when people have EVs on their drive, they need to use those as portable battery storage. We need to completely rethink how we store energy in this country. And batteries are one thing, but you look at hydrogen and a lot of other ways as well.
All right, thank you. Question from the gentleman over there, and from the lady behind him, and from the gentleman over there.
Yes, I'm Robert Morland. I'm a former member of the European Parliament. Isn't actually one thing we should be saying about climate change and why net zero is important is quite simply because it's going to affect you, and it's affecting you almost, you can say now. I mean, I live in Gloucester. We now get flooding every year. South of us, we have North Somerset, which I understand is the place in the country which is most likely to go underwater totally with climate change. Now, I don't think we should be too happy about that, unless you live somewhere else. And you will remember in that case, about 5 years ago, there was a heavy flooding in that area, which we actually got a lot of stick because we were thought to have handled it badly. So in terms of that argument, we should be bringing it in now. You remember the Yorkshire one, which was handled actually very well by Rory Stewart. It is coming now.
Thank you. And the lady behind, and then the gentleman over there.
Yes, Anna Halpern-Landy, Ortis. I'm very interested in the growth and investment case and how the Conservatives can bring that forward in a louder voice. There is absolutely no rationale to say that there's any conflict between growth, economic growth, and net zero agenda. And in fact, you can take a case study of California, which if it was a separate country would be the 5th largest economy in the world, behind Germany and Japan, where the California Global Warming Solution Bill was put into place. California met its 2020 emissions targets. The GDP per capita remains one of the highest in the world at $90,000 per head, and there was no impact. In fact, GDP continued to grow just as fast, having met those targets. And I see that the UK has a fantastic opportunity for growth, for jobs, for skills, and I struggle to understand why there seems to be no rhetoric or appetite for a kind of policy that recognizes that good environmental policy is also good economic policy.
Thank you.
Can you comment on that, please?
Understood. Thank you. And then the gentleman at the back.
Hi, Tom Keogh from the Duke of Edinburgh's Awards. Obviously, a lot of the conversation is around what infrastructure we can put in place, and a lot of, the solutions to reaching net zero. But of course, a lot of that as well comes from, equipping the future labor force. And a lot of what we're looking at is the futures of young people. And you can see in the current jobs climate that there's quite limited opportunities for young people in the green energy careers, and especially in comparison with fossil fuel companies such as Shell, offering internships and subsidies on education. And my question is, what are we doing as a country in order to ensure that there's more meaningful support and opportunities for young people's career trajectories, particularly in terms of upskilling them in order to implement all of these solutions that you're talking about?
Thank you. All right, so question on, it's here now, why don't we talk about it? Why don't we talk more about the investment case, and what do we do about opportunities for young people? Alexander, why don't you go first?
Yes, thank you. I'll take your gentleman lady question about the future of the labour force and talking about it, and it's sort of one and the same. I think we are talking about it. I think the last government had talked a lot about the growth. I think the problem is, though, people have heard a lot of talk from the government, but don't see any real action, and that is the problem when it comes to it. And there's that sort of authenticity gap, which is a big concern when it comes to aspects of it. Like when we went from the change, talking about the hydrogen from town gas in the 60s, early 70s, to natural gas in the pipes, the government at the time apparently created 12 academies to train technicians of how to actually make that changeover. 12. We've never done the labour force change like that since. I remember when I used to work on Crossrail, I think Crossrail built or founded 2 tunnelling academies in the UK, i.e. places to learn how to tunnel. And that was at the time, like, wow, a company's investing 2 academies to train people to do a certain skills. We need to actually set up academies to actually train the workforce and aspects like that. On to your points about the gentleman, actually I used to work for Shell in a life before I got selected. Shell was already having problems when it came to labour force. People didn't want to work for Shell. The money and obviously the pay was good, but people, the younger generation, were more having their heads turned by the renewable companies. So I don't think there is that problem anymore. In fact, I think that's the converse problem. One of the many reasons why companies like Shell and are getting more involved in this space is because they are struggling and to appear more green. It's not necessarily because they want to be greenwashing, because they want to appeal to labour force. They are missing out. This was a few years ago on some of the best talent to go to renewable companies. People actually chose to go away from that. And we're seeing that at the moment with the labour crisis. We have a labour crisis across the world. It's the employees sort of can choose where they go now. So we need to make sure more companies are going, because the young generation actively want to go and work for better and greener companies. On the last point about the sort of flooding in Somerset, as far as I'm aware, Somerset used to flood for many times. In fact, most of Somerset used to be underwater if you go back far enough. And I think we have to be very careful about equating a natural disaster like flooding always with climate change. Obviously, they work together, but there's a lot of places, and I can speak for my own constituency, where there has been an increase of flooding in part of my constituency over the last 10, 20 years, and maybe part of it's due to climate change. Or it could be about over 1,000 new homes placed on the flood fields, which apparently they've mitigated, but massively increasing runoff. So we have to be very careful about what we're equating flooding to, and we have to look at it in the holistic way. Ultimately, we are building a lot of bad homes on floodplains, and we need better homes in the right place as well as climate change. But I do think when people are worried about flooding, they need to actually understand the implications of climate change as well. It's a valid point, but we also need to work with home building. Sam?
Yeah, so to take them in order, on the point about talking more about the impacts of climate change here, I mean, I agree with Alexander that the conversation can easily sort of fall over into alarmism and inaccurate hyperbolic statements. I think we need to be very careful of that. But I do think we should talk more about it, because I think these changes are coming. There's good scientific evidence that the Climate Change Committee has gathered on what these impacts are going to be across the UK. And I think there's sometimes a sense that climate change is something that will affect people overseas, and we're doing it almost to help other people rather than ourselves. But I think there is a very strong self-interested case for mitigating climate change. And I think, we have this talk about the cost of net zero. I think talking about some of the impacts of climate change and how it's going to affect us economically will help us show what's on the other side of that cost-benefit ledger. So I think we should do more of that, but we need to do it in a sensitive and accurate way, I think, as Alexander said. On the point about growth, the growth opportunity of climate action, I couldn't agree more. And I agree with Alexander. I think people have talked a lot about this within government. I think it's quite prominent in how a lot of Conservatives speak about this issue. But just to sort of bring out some stats and like some of what we're seeing from other countries to try and capture this amazing market opportunity that 90% of world GDP being covered by a net zero target represents. So the US has just passed an Inflation Reduction Act, which it thinks will lead to 950 million new solar panels, 120,000 new wind turbines being built by 2030. The EU is aiming for 320 gigawatts of solar by 2025, 600 gigawatts by 2030 under its Repowering EU initiative. China is going for 1,200 gigawatts of solar by 2030. So there is a massive global race going on for these, for dominance in these energy technologies, and then the new technologies as well, like hydrogen, carbon capture, cultured meat even. Again, lots of countries are pouring money into innovation and R&D because they want to be the world leader in these things. And I think it would be absolutely criminal to back away from net zero and to surrender these amazing early starts that we have in lots of these industries here in the UK to other countries overseas to basically accept that we're just going to import other countries' technologies and sacrifice the job opportunity here in the UK. That, I think, is actually what is economic self-harm, which some people sometimes say net zero is. So yeah, I think we should absolutely talk much more about it. I think there's a hugely positive case that we can make around growth and climate. And then finally on schools and young people, I think this is a huge issue. I don't think we have enough skills to meet the net zero strategy that we have. I think lots of reports have been written about this by people more expert in it than me. But I think, mainstreaming net zero industries in lots of our technical education qualifications, I think, would be a start, as well as some of the measures that Alexander's talked about.
Can I just pick up one thing you just said about that? And you said we don't have the skills for net zero. Completely agree with that. But then again, we don't also have the skills for not net zero at the moment. We have a huge skills problem in this country. If your normal boiler breaks, you're talking days or weeks to get that fixed by a normal plumber, not net zero. So we in the country need to improve all our skills, and when we do that, we need to make sure net zero is essential and integral to those new people we bring in.
All right, we've got time, I think, for one more round of questions. Gentleman here in the red velvet jacket. Is it velvet? Red something jacket. And then the lady there and the gentleman behind him. Sorry, I don't think I'm going to get all four in. I apologise.
Hi there, Digby Walker from the Carbon Trust. I think one of the biggest issues we have, just looking at the question that we're talking about as a panel, vote blue, go green, exploring the Conservative case for net zero, do we as the Conservative Party really believe in net zero, and do we know what that means? And I think there's a big communication piece in what net zero means in terms of temperature pathways and alignment to what the regulatory requirements and the ramping and ratcheting up of net zero actually is going to mean. We have people like Lord Frost who are incredibly influential on a lot of Conservative Party members and other members of the party itself. We need to have more communication on what it means and believe in it as a party.
Thank you. And the lady there.
Thank you. Sarah Ingham. I'm a columnist on Conservative Home, and following on from that observation, the pieces I've written on net zero have generally attracted a huge response, often quite sceptical, it must be said. And so there's also a question mark over whether the whole issue is actually of the impact of climate change. It's not actually a fig leaf for some very poor performance of agencies like the Environment Agency, which have allowed places to flood, and for poor performances by local councils, which are very conveniently blaming climate change for their own failings. Thank you.
Okay. Is it a fig leaf for bad performance? And the gentleman 2 rows behind?
Thank you. Sahil Shah, co-founder of Sustainable Seaweed. When it comes to net zero, it's blindingly clear that the number that matters is the global number, not the British number. And when it comes to integrated work with, say, the Foreign Office and the industrial strategy in ensuring that Britain helps other countries...
I'm going to have to make it a question, sorry.
Okay. The question is, how can industrial strategy and foreign policy be integrated in the way that Britain can help accelerate the global transition to net zero?
Great question, thank you. Sam, you first.
Yeah, so very quickly picking up on those points. So firstly, about the kind of bits of the Conservative movement that are sceptical, I sort of hinted at that in my opening remarks, but I think, you know, despite this very long heritage of environmental leadership within the Conservative Party, there's always been, I think, voices that are sceptical. I think a part of it comes from a sort of dislike of some of the solutions to these challenges and the fear that it leads to a bigger state, more state intervention in the economy. I don't think that it has to be that way. I think there are Conservative solutions that are market-based, that are private sector-led, that are focused more on that private investment piece that I think can deal with some of those concerns. But absolutely, I think it does damage the message that the Conservative Party sends out to the country to have this division. And I know, you know, speaking to a lot of MPs, even ones who are in the net zero scrutiny group, I think they would acknowledge that, you know, they signed, you know, the manifesto in 2019, had that clear commitment to delivering net zero by 2050. And I think, you know, we can all have a debate about how to get there and the impact of some of those policies, but I do think that, yeah, there is very broad consensus about that end goal within the parliamentary party, even if some of the comments sort of suggest otherwise. On the point about whether sort of talk about climate action as a fig leaf for underperformance, I think there is definitely underperformance in all of those agencies you've talked about and lots of valid criticisms of them. I do, however, think that, you know, the kind of warning lights around climate action are undeniable, and we've seen lots of them this year. You know, over 40-degree temperatures here in the UK in summer for the first time, a record high. Places like Germany flooded, wildfires in Siberia. You know, the scale of impacts across the globe, not just in the UK. You know, they are getting worse, and I think. Yeah, I do think the science has been pretty clear on this. To your question, the last one about foreign policy and how we can integrate net zero and climate action into that, I think it is absolutely critical that we do, because, you know, we are just 1% of global emissions. We're not going to solve this challenge just through what we do here in the UK in terms of reducing our emissions. We've got to use our diplomatic levers to encourage other countries to also adopt. Fortunately, I think we've made a good start on that with COP26 when Alok Sharma took up the reins. Something like 30% of world GDP was covered by net zero targets. That's now over 90%. He got a very impressive agreement at Glasgow, I think, to phase down coal-fired power stations, for example. So I think we have made progress through diplomacy. I think the other key piece, though, is thinking about how our trade and aid can also help the kind of other two levers of our foreign policy. We've got to, if we're developing these amazing clean technologies here in the UK, we've got to export them freely to other markets so other countries can benefit from this cheap technology. And I think we've got to support mitigation and financing of infrastructure overseas to help other countries build out this infrastructure, hopefully with British technology and through British companies, so that they can reduce emissions, and that will benefit us directly here in terms of less warming.
Thank you. And Alexander?
Great, and I completely agree with Sam. We're in reverse order about when it comes to foreign policy. We need to actually see what we're good at. We need to use our foreign policy levers to really talk about selling those products abroad that we are developing, selling those skills, but also what we are good at the UK. And I think COP26 was a huge success, mainly on the finance side of things. You have Mark Carney doing that. That is where the UK does excel at, where we do lead the world. We can lead by example, and we can produce those financial models. So we need to really lean heavily into what we can already do and use that as the tool. I think a very interesting point about aid as well. We need to also make sure our aid is used in a way that actually helps the environment and restores nature. It's not just about net zero. I think about biodiversity loss as well. So we can really use foreign policy as a tool. To Lady's question about are we allowing climate change excuse for poor performance, I 100% agree with you. I think this is the problem. It goes back to my earlier comments about virtual signalling, about declaring climate emergency. I think we're allowing too many people, whether it's councils, organisations, to get away with poor performance and blame it on not doing what they should do. Even little things, like so many councils now declaring, we're going to have wildflower meadows. No, they're not. They just don't want to cut the grass. They want to cut costs. It's complete rubbish. We know climate change is an issue, but what's going to be more impactful on the environment, really? Having a few bits you don't cut the grass, or actually having a serious look at how, let's say, they source their energy or what they power their vehicles by. We allow organisations to get away with too much on the back of climate change. And that's not to say climate change isn't hugely affecting the country and going to hugely affect the global and actually have increased things. We talk about the high temperatures and wildfire. Of course it is. But we can't allow it to be excuses. And we're constantly seeing excuse after excuse after excuse of people not doing their jobs. We need people to actually say, rather than saying, oh, we can't do this because of climate change, we say, well, we are affected by climate change, and this is the things we're doing to mitigate the climate change impact of it. So I completely agree with you, there are too many poor excuses. And on the last question about do we believe in net zero, I think the public does believe in net zero. I think the parliamentarians do believe in net zero. But we don't need to worry about the regulation and carbon. And I think when we start going down that rabbit hole, which is very important, we all clearly care about the topic in this issue, we lose the room. We lose the wider room. We should talk about saying net zero going to improve our life from a better job, a cleaner home, cleaner air to breathe, more wildlife. That's how we talk about it. And if people can get on board with those tenets, then they agree with net zero. We shouldn't worry about too much whether they believe in carbon trading or understand that. And as soon as we start talking about those issues, and the climate change minister has arrived, we lose the audience. So climate change minister, stop talking about carbon, start talking about birds and bees and cleaner air.
And with that perfect segue, 30 seconds late. I hope you enjoy your coffee. And thank you to my brilliant panellists. Thank you to all of you for your great questions. And enjoy the rest of the day.